Dyson with the St. Louis Center for Play Therapy Training. I'm here today in my play therapy room with a play therapy technique that I use with children who are dealing with anxiety and who have worries about things. So I created something here that I want you to see, and then we'll talk about how I made this and how you can use it as a play therapy technique in regards to anxiety. So I call this technique a worry web. When I introduce this technique to a child, I don't call it a worry web. I will begin by talking about worries, and that sometimes kids have things that they worry about. With some children, I may already know what the worries are that they have or why they're worried about things. If it's a new child, I might use this technique to assess them and their worries and the intensity of their worries. And so what you'll need to do this particular activity is a skein of yarn and a scissors and some markers or pencils or crayons and a pad of Post-it notes. And I like the super sticky kind for this particular activity. So what I'll do with a child, like I said, I won't tell them we're going to make a worry web. I'll say, you know what, we're going to talk about some of the things that you worry about and how big those worries are for you. So for instance, let's say I'm working with a child who has lost a parent to death. And I might say, so let's talk about the things that you worry about since your dad died. And so what is one of those things? So they'll take a Post-it note and they'll write down on a piece of paper what they worry about. Or if they're unable to write it, they can draw a picture or I'll write it for them. So a child who lost a parent might be fearful that, am I going to die too? And so we'd write that on the piece of paper, onto the Post-it note, and then I would ask them to take the yarn and cut off a piece of yarn that represents how big is that worry. Great way for me to engage, to assess the intensity of that worry. Is it small? Is it kind of medium? Or is it really large? And then I'll validate the size of the piece of yarn that they cut. And so what we would do is we would take the first one and we would tie it onto some kind of stationary object here in the playroom, like this toy shelf right here. And then we would tie the other end, so usually the first one's going to need to be a long one. Tie it onto the end of something else. And then we'll attach that particular Post-it worry onto that piece of yarn. So that child I gave the example would say, am I going to die too? So here's that particular one. Another worry that a child might have in that situation is, well, if my dad died, what if my mom dies, and then who's going to take care of me? So that might be a worry as well. So what happens is as you tie these together, fasten them together, it takes on the look of a web. And usually, my experience has been most children will figure out that, oh, this is a web. And then they get the whole concept, and that the worries that we have sometimes can become very tangled up, much like a spider's web. So once it's all put together, once all the worries have been put onto the web, we'll go over them one by one. We'll talk about that worry. We'll process it a little bit more. For instance, this particular worry, will I die too? And we'll talk about, well, what can you do, or what can the grown-ups in your world help you do so that you don't worry about dying? And we might talk about, well, maybe my mom is going to help me make sure I eat healthy foods, and then I get enough sleep, and that I wear my seatbelt in the car, all those kinds of things to take care of themselves so they know that they can be safe. And once we come up with some ways of coping with that worry, maybe we're not going to be able to make the worry go away, but we might be able to reduce some of the intensity of it. We'll take a scissors and we'll symbolically snip that particular worry to represent that particular worry is being addressed. So you would go on with each individual one and come up with coping skills. I have used this with children one-on-one individually. I've used it with a group of kids, specifically a group of children who were meeting together because were all families, children and families who had divorced. So we would do a worry web specific to what kids worry about in regards to divorce. I've used it with families as well. So it's a great way for me to assess the intensity of their worries. It's a great way for them to kind of get a grasp of how big or how small their worries are, and then to also come up with some ways of dealing with and coping with those anxieties as well. I did have something unique that happened one time with a child I was working on. Once the web was completed and he had all his worries hooked together, he said, you know, I think we need to put a spider right here in the middle. So he got some pipe cleaners, chenille stems, and he crafted a spider, and he put it in the middle. And that spider pretty much was symbolic of what was at the root of all of his worry. So I sometimes and now actually use that particular symbol and have a child or a family or a group craft a spider to put in the middle of the web that sort of represents what the core of all of those worries might be. So this is a fun technique. It's easy to use. I find it to be a tool that children, teenagers, and adults will easily engage in and really participate in. So if you have some children that you're working with that are dealing with anxiety, have them craft a worry web and come up with ways of dealing with their anxiety.